Ormiston Genealogy Part 3.
Seckel 1565. Darnley fell ill of the measles, and Mary's attention to her lover was a grave cause of scandal to the virtuous Elizabeth. One of the complaints which Throckmorton was afterwards instructed to make to Mary was, that she has so far proceeded in love of him, as he, being sick of the measles, which is an infectious disease, she could not be persuaded to tarry from him, but attended upon him with as much diligence and care as any could. Yea, and that she so much desired to proceed in marriage with him, as, if others had not been scrupulous and fearful to assist the same, she had been affianced to him. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 3 April 1565. Elizabeth's cunning diplomacy had, in fact, made it impossible for Mary to marry at all without drawing upon Scotland foreign complications or civil war, and perhaps both. Murray was heartsick of the business when he recognised that not only was Mary bent upon marrying Darnley, but intended to do so under Catholic auspices, and after an angry scene with his sister, he rode out of Stirling on this night, retiring to St Andrews, and leaving Mary to her own devices. As Lethington started a few days afterwards for England ostensibly to soften Elizabeth. Buchanan says that there was now much talk abroad of the Queen's marriage with Darnley, and his secret recourse to her, but also of the too great familiarity betwixt her and David Rizzio. Murray, who by his plain downright advice to his sister got nothing but ill will, resolved to leave the court, that so he might not be thought the author of what was acted there. Buchanan was too much biased by religion to be accepted unquestionably as trustworthy, when he hints at Mary's immorality at this period being the cause of Murray's leaving court. As we have seen, there was ample political and religious reason for Murray's displeasure, and he was no doubt also annoyed at the Queen's imprudently displayed affection for Darnley, and at the growing favour to Rizzio, owing to Mary's new Catholic surroundings. But all these causes existed apart from the suggested immorality of Mary at the time, which was afterwards assumed by Murray, Buchanan, Knox, and the rest of their party for political ends. Darnley remained doubtfully sick all through April, lacking no attendance or comfort, oft visited by the greatest and by the fairest, if that may help his malady. And as Mary and her court travelled in her progress, one noble after another fell away from her, till none but Lennox and the Earl of Athol stayed to witness Darnley's fateful wooing. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 7-18 April 1565. Randolph wrote to England that Darnley was ill with the measles pox. Not more than about 10 days later, Queen Mary was privately married to him at Rizzio's apartments in Stirling Castle, with Sinclair officiating. The exact date of the ceremony is not known, but from collateral circumstances it must have been between the 7th and the 18th of April. 28 April 1565, Elizabeth was in a furious rage, alternatively ordering and cajoling Darnley and his father to return to England at once, and, amongst other things, positively hinting that she might marry Darnley himself if he came. She went to the length of promising Lethington that if Mary would marry to her satisfaction, she would make a clear pronouncement as to the succession. But the promise still was vague. That bait had now lost its savour, and the Scottish minister answered coldly. Elizabeth then angrily asked him if the Darnley wedding had already taken place, to which he answered that he did not know. Lady Lennox, though in disgrace, was jubilant, for she was confident that her son, if not already King Consort of Scotland, would be so before many weeks had passed. For once the counsels of Elizabeth and her advisers were utterly distracted, and something like panic reigned. They were all sure that Mary and Darnley were already married. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. May 1565. Great efforts were made to gain the consent of Châtel-Hérault and the rest of the nobles to Mary's marriage to Henry Stuart, in order that Elizabeth's answer, when it came, should be confronted by an accomplished fact, and when Lethington reached Newark on his way home, he was met by Beaton with instructions from Mary for him to return to London again, in order that she might have time to work her will. The imprudent new message that Lethington was instructed to give to Elizabeth was that Mary had been beguiled with fair speech too long. She would be fed with yea and nay no longer, but had summoned her Parliament, and would follow their advice as to her marriage. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. July 4, 2013, 57. 12 May 1565. Before arriving in Edinburgh, the travellers learned by a letter from the Queen herself that she had summoned a meeting of nobles at Stirling for the following day to create Darnley Lord Armagnac, Earl of Ross, and to obtain from those assembled a pledge to support her in her resolve to wed her cousin. Murray and Argyll, almost alone, stood aloof, demanding that the abolition of the Mass in Scotland should be a condition of their consent, to which it is clear that Mary would never agree, since the only good she could hope to gain from the union was the support of Spain and the Catholics to her English claims. The rest of the Scottish nobles, even feeble Châtelherault, came to heel promptly at their queen's call, for she was a wilful woman determined to have her way. "Majesty and love can ill sit on the same seat," quoted Throckmorton, but highly inflamed as Mary's affections might be for Darnley, she was at no loss to find plausible pretexts for the bold step she was taking. A weak foreign prince she would not have, because he would be useless for her ends. A strong one she could not get. 3 years of experience had proved to her that Elizabeth was playing with her, and she determined to defy England and the Protestants, and throw herself entirely into the arms of Spain and the Catholics, even to the enslavement of her own people. There was no native suitor but Darnley who could have united in her favour the countenance of the English disaffected Catholics and the goodwill of Spain, the two permanent elements of danger to Elizabeth. When love and apparent policy go together, it is hard to withstand them, and Mary had her way. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 15 May 1565. Mary met her nobles in the Parliament Hall of Stirling Castle and received unanimous agreement to her marriage with Darnley. Moray was known to vehemently oppose the marriage, as was Elizabeth of England. 7 July 1565. Mary, when the news had come to her at Perth that conspiracies were hatching and the nobles of both factions mustering their retainers, hurried back to Edinburgh, successfully avoiding a plan that had been laid by Murray's friends for her capture. For 2 months previously rumours had spread that she was actually married to Darnley, and the assertion has been seized upon by her apologists as an explanation of July 4, 2013-58, her attendance upon him during his long confinement to bed by illness. There is, however, nothing in the form of proof that the wedding took place in April or May, except the assumed familiarity of the pair, and the confident hints of Lady Lennox and others that the union was now indissoluble. But the arrival of Hay of Balmerino on this day with Philip's assurance must have satisfied Mary that she might now safely indulge her fancy without sacrificing her great ambition. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 9 July 1565. There is every probability that the alleged private wedding on this day actually took place. Randolph wrote hurriedly to the Queen a week later that this Queen was secretly married in her own palace to my Lord Darnley, not above 7 persons being present, and went to their bed to Lord Seaton's house. This is known by means of one of the priests present at the Mass. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 28 July 1565, at 9 o'clock at night, to the surprise and indignation of many, 3 heralds stood at the market cross of Edinburgh, and with a flourish of trumpets announced that the Queen had resolved to wed. In face of the Holy Kirk, with the Richt Noble and illustrious Prince Henry, Duke of Albany, in respect of quilk marriage, and during the time thereof, we ordain and consent that he be named and styled King of this our kingdom. This last provision was illegal without the consent of the Scots Parliament, but Mary could refuse her bridegroom nothing, and there was nothing his pride did not covet. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 29 July 1565. The next morning before 6 o'clock, Mary, clad in deep mourning robes, with her wide widow's hood, walked between Lennox and Athol into the chapel of Holyrood. There she was left alone, whilst Darnley, clad in splendid garb and glittering gems, was led in by his father. The banns were proclaimed for the 3rd time, and then the fateful words were spoken that made the 19-year-old hobbledehoy king consort of Scotland. Rich rings were exchanged and the troth plighted, and then, after prayers and blessings over the wedded pair, the young bridegroom kissed his wife upon the lips, and left her whilst Mass was being said. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. July 4, 2013-59. 29 July 1565. After creating Darnley Duke of Albany, Mary was publicly married to him in Holyrood Chapel. Darnley's personal appearance, his accomplishments and superficial culture had blinded the Queen to his true character. His folly, his ungovernable temper, his arrogance, recklessness, and grasping ambition soon made him hateful to all whom he should have taken pains to conciliate, while he lost the Queen's affections by drunkenness and other low vices. Darnley had determined to obtain the crown matrimonial, and this the Queen naturally hesitated to grant to anyone so unfit for supreme power. The disaffected nobles seized upon these dissensions to further their own schemes. Darnley had conceived a violent hatred to the Queen's Italian secretary Rizzio, who, he believed, had influenced the Queen in her refusal. August 1565. The feud between Moray, James Stuart, and Darnley, the pivot on which so many of the intrigues and tragedies of Mary's reign turned, began almost immediately after Darnley's arrival in Scotland. Darnley resented the power and wealth of his wife's base-born brother. Darnley seems throughout to have had a truer insight into Moray's character than Mary, who was blinded by his apparent bluntness of speech and character, and was with difficulty persuaded of his persistent treachery to her. Barely a month after the happy wedding, the country had been divided once more into the old Protestant and Catholic divisions. Moray, leader of the Protestants, had come out in open revolt against his half-sister and her husband. Galled by the eclipse of his power over Mary and the nation's affairs, Moray had been made even more venomous by insults from Darnley. The young king had even suggested that Moray owned far too much land. He might care to give some of it up? Moray did not like this approach. It earned Darnley a good measure of hatred and enmity. Moray was in constant communication with Queen Elizabeth and her agents during the intrigues that preceded the marriage with Darnley. Supported by the English Queen's promises, led the revolt known as the Chaseabout Raid, which followed upon it. When the insurrection was crushed by the prompt action of the Queen, Mary of Scotland, Moray was compelled to fly into England, but was eventually pardoned and reinstalled. July 4, 2013-60. There seems little doubt that Moray was concerned in the plots for the murder of Rizzio, and later of Darnley. But he managed his share in these transactions with such skills that he did not appear as an active agent in either. He was, however, repeatedly denounced as their confederate by such minor actors in both murders as were brought to justice. In the events that follow on Darnley's murder, the abduction of the Queen Mary, and her mysterious marriage with Bothwell, Moray played no open part. Apparently satisfied that his sister's destruction one way or the other was secured, he withdrew to France, and waited the march of events. 1565 matters between James Ormiston and Lady Sinclair had come to a head about mid-1565. 2008 August 1565. Mary and Darnley slept at Stirling on this night on their way to meet the rebel lords at Glasgow. September 1565. Mary pregnant with James VI. 19 September 1565. Bothwell had hurried back from France at Mary's call, and had only landed, after much danger from English pirates, at Eyemouth on this day, being received graciously at Holyrood on the following day. He was at once restored to his office of Lieutenant of the Middle Marches, and shortly afterwards was appointed a member of the Privy Council. His bitter enmity to Murray and to England, and the fact that he had fled from Scotland rather than face the foregone conclusion of his condemnation by the latter for his former offence of prison breaking and flight, rendered him an excellent instrument for Mary's purposes at this juncture. He was moreover a man of strong purpose, forceful and overbearing, and consequently would naturally appeal to the Queen in her then mood. It need hardly be emphasized that there was no suggestion of love-making between them at this early stage. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. September 1565. After the surrender of Castle Campbell, Mary was escorted to St Andrews by all the loyal gentlemen of Fife. September 1565. Mary and Darnley, despite opposition by some nobles, married at Holyrood. They were publicly married in the chapel. Those opposed to Darnley rebel, but are hounded out of Scotland Chaseabout Raid. Mary supported by Bothwell. 8 October 1565. The hopes of Murray and his friends in Dumfries waned, as they saw that Elizabeth's hands were tied, and that no effectual aid reached them. A last desperate attempt he made to find favour with his sister at the expense of Darnley, whom he refused to recognise as king. Mary's reply to his letter was that he was a bastard, a rebel, and a traitor, and should be promptly punished as such. On this day the dauntless Queen sallied from Edinburgh at the head of her troops and attended but by one woman. She was armed, and wore steel, it was said, and with her rode her stripling husband in his fine gilt corselet. But close behind followed a stronger than he, the square martial figure of James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, newly called back from exile. Rough and hirsute, shaggy and stern, the strong man took the place of leader at once. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 12 November 1565. Randolph writes to Cecil that James Ormiston has come from the Duke of Châtelherault with his submission, and I think it shall not be hard to have his 166 pardon granted. 21 and 23 December 1565. James Ormiston of that ilk and Robert Ormiston of Old Melrose, his father's brother and surety, entered into an obligation to David Spottiswoode of that ilk and John Spottiswoode his second son. December 1565. If the jealous lover casket letter was written by Margaret Sinclair, she and James Ormiston would have been already married, and probably Mary's interest in Ormiston was also well underway. I suggest date of Sinclair letter was written mid-1565 following Mary's progresses on the border, and Ormiston was subsequently called to Edinburgh on matters of state. Per Gio's notes. Rizzio murdered. Moray suddenly re-enters Edinburgh, door flew wide, I saw them there. Ruth then in mail complete, George Douglas, Kerr of Fordenside, and Rizzio at their feet. With rapiers drawn and pistols bent, they seized their wretched prey, they wrenched his garments from her hands and stabbed him where he lay. Atone. Ref. Mary Queen of Scots. A Narrative and Defence by Rev. Alexander Walker. 1 March 1566. The deed of association was signed by Argyll, Morton, Boyd, Ruthven and Lethington, and, according to Darnley's statement, was acquiesced in by a large number of Scottish gentlemen of all ranks. The exiled lords in England, Murray, Rothes and Kirkcaldy, and of course Randolph and Bedford, were also cognizant of the plot, and pledges of pardon and mutual support and protection were given by Darnley and the whole of the other conspirators. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. March 1566. Darnley was persuaded by Morton, Ruthven and other leaders of the disaffected party that the old and deformed Italian was his wife's lover, and they so played upon his vindictive folly that he finally became a party to the plot for murdering Rizzio in the Queen's presence. The outrage, in which, no doubt, the Queen's own life was aimed at, took place on this day, but Darnley, who seems to have been entirely the dupe of his confederates, was immediately won over by the Queen to renounce his late associates and disclaim all participation in their crime. They revenged themselves by giving the amplest proofs of his complicity. Henceforth, the Queen seems to have felt July 4, 2013-63, not unnatural contempt and repugnance for him. His enemies constantly urged her to divorce him, but this she always hesitated to do, hoping, as she said, that peradventure he might change. Failing here, the conspirators determined to take stronger measures. It seems pretty evident, too, that the keener-sighted among them hoped from the first to implicate the Queen, and so ruin her cause in Scotland. The Earl of Bothwell was induced to become the prime mover in the plot to kill Darnley, by promises from the leading lords that they would put him forward as Darnley's successor. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 9 March 1566. The brutal murder of Rizzio took place in Mary's apartments. The Queen was supping on the night of the murder. She had with her the Countess of Argyll and Lord Robert Stewart, her base brother and sister, Rizzio himself, and several more attendants. The conspirators were admitted by Darnley through a secret staircase from his apartments below, of which only the Queen and himself had keys. The head of this staircase is visible from all parts of the supper room, and so when the sinister gauntness of Ruthven was seen lifting the arras and following Darnley into the Queen's presence, a sense of disaster must have gripped everyone present. To the shouts of, "A Douglas! A Douglas!" the conspirators put an end to the resistance of Mary and the vacillations of Darnley, and hunting Rizzio from room to room, dropped him dead at last, and near 60 stabs in his body, on the blood-stained floor. After the murder, the Queen escaped to Dunbar, taking Darnley with her, whom she had skillfully detached from the party which had just been using him as its tool. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 9 March 1566. The government in London was fully informed of every stage of the proceedings by Randolph and Bedford, and on this day the black deed was done. Mary was in the 6th month of her pregnancy, and as it had always been a feature of the plan that the secretary should be murdered in her presence, the object was certainly to discredit her morally, if not to cause her injury or death from the shock. Morton and Lindsay were present at the deed and professed a desire to save Rizzio to be hanged next morning, but, if such was really their wish, it was overborne by the bloodlust of others. Gio noted, Morton for hanging. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. July 4, 2013-64. 10 March 1566. The next day Murray, Kirkcaldy rose and the rest of the fugitive lords rode to Holyrood in triumph. Before they arrived, assurance of Mary's pardon reached them, for she thought at least that her brother would save her life. Anything was better than the unchecked control of a puerile hothead like Darnley, surrounded by men who had proved themselves traitors and cutthroats. A council of the lords that night decided to isolate the Queen in the castle of Stirling until she had approved of all the acts committed. Mary herself says in her letter to Beaton that her death or perpetual captivity was intended, And Blackwood, in his Life of Mary Maitland Club, avers that Murray at this conclave voted for her death. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots, 11 March 1566, but Mary was no ordinary woman. After all her resources as queen, politician and diplomatist had been defeated, there still remained to her the abundant armory of her personal fascination, her feminine wiles, her ready tears, her persuasive caresses, and to these she turned now, as ever, in her hour of greatest need. First, she readily granted everything that was required of her by Murray, Morton and the rest of them, and then she opened her batteries upon Lethington. She was in fear, she said, of the rough soldiery that kept ward over her. Pray let them be withdrawn. There could surely be nothing to fear from her now. Commit her to the guard of her dear husband for the night. He would answer for her. Darnley, proud of her renewed affection, added his prayers to hers, and as she walked to her own chamber, with her husband and her brother supporting her on either side, the guards that were posted about her to prevent escape were withdrawn. Ruthven's report asserts that when Darnley came down after supper, about 6 or 7 in the evening to receive from the lords the act of indemnity for the Queen's signature, he asked that the guards might be removed. They replied that if he ordered it, it should be done, but they feared mischief, and he must be responsible for the result, as they thought the Queen would carry him away to Dunbar or inside Edinburgh Castle. Darnley gave his pledge to them, and the lords then went to Morton's house to supper. How far Darnley's jealousy of Rizzio was warranted has been a subject of fierce controversy. The Italian, it has been admitted, was elderly, though a contemporary portrait of him presents him as not altogether ill-favoured. We have seen from Melville's July 4, 2013 65, admission that from the first Mary had been very confidential with him. But, as has been shown, there was good political reason for her being so, the correspondence for the Great Catholic Alliance with Spain, Rome, and Florence being entirely in his hands after Rollitt's dismissal. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots, March, June 1566. Mary's relations with Darnley settled down into an uneasy truce until the birth of her child. Darnley had not reformed his behaviour. During her confinement he vagabondized every night. In these circumstances it was natural that Mary should come to rely increasingly for political advice on those nobles who had proved themselves loyal to her throughout the 2 crises which she had faced in the past year. Into this category fell notably James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, who as he leapt clear of the lion pit at Holyrood, and rode off to summon Mary's subjects successfully to her assistance, seemed to display that combination of resource, loyalty and strength which Mary had so persistently sought among her Scottish nobles. Footnote: Mary's well-known memoir, in which she expressed a preference for the services of a loyal man of low estate to those of the nobility. Geo noted, Ormiston, and need a copy of Mary's memoir, is attributed by Prince Labanoff to the period directly after Riccio's death. But as it is in Neyu's handwriting, it seems more likely that Mary dictated it to her secretary later during her captivity. Ref. Mary Queen of Scots by Antonia Fraser. Mary visits injured Bothwell at Hermitage Castle, June 1566, when her time approached, and it became a question as to who should remain in the castle beside her husband when the looked-for event took place. Mary wisely resisted the distrustful hints of Darnley, Bothwell, Huntley, and the Bishop of Ross that Murray should be put under lock and key during her illness, to prevent his bringing back the Rizzio murderers, and it was Murray and Argyle and their wives, and not Bothwell, who stayed in charge of the Queen's safety, with Erskine Marr, the keeper of the fortress. Bothwell, who hated the English with all his heart, was a safer man than Murray on the border, and to his own lands accordingly he was sent, salved with the great fief of Dunbar. In her apprehension of her coming trial Mary made her will, and in July 4, 2013 66. This too she had regard for the proprieties, leaving to her husband amongst other things, the ring with which he wedded her, and as Castelnau told Guzman on the way back to France in May, though they did not trust each other, the Queen and her husband now dwelt for a short time together at least without open scandal. Labanoff and many other authorities, following Randolph's statement, say that Mary had intended to go to Stirling for her confinement, and that she actually went there for that purpose, but returned to Edinburgh when Darnley joined her at Stirling, it is said to avoid him. That Mary had some intention of going to Stirling is also mentioned by Guzman, but she did not go. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots, 19 June 1566. On this morning Mary's child, James VI, was born at Edinburgh Castle. and Mary Beaton ran with the glad news to the waiting courtiers, amongst whom was James Melville, praying night and day, as he tells us, for a happy delivery of his queen. Hardly had the news passed Mary Beaton's lips before Melville was in the saddle and scouring southward to London as fast as a horse could gallop to his brother Sir Robert's house with the intelligence. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. End of July 1566. Suddenly Mary, without knowledge of her husband, left Edinburgh. She had been overbold during the first days of her illness, and had consequently suffered from a hollow cough. She was still in delicate health, barely 6 weeks after her delivery, and quite unfit for arduous travel, but she had apparently conceived a violent repugnance to her unhappy consort, and left him. What she said of him just previous to her departure, writes the Earl of Bedford, cannot with modesty, nor with the honour of a queen, be reported. Her journey was more like a flight than a pleasure trip, and all men wondered to see her, with but a few followers of low rank, hurry to the waterside at Newhaven, and embark upon a vessel awaiting her. Manned by Bothwell's retainers, Geo noted, Ormiston, robbers and pirates Buchanan calls them. Sailing for the castle of Alloa, she there took up her residence. In what particular way she offended whilst there is not clear, for Bothwell does not appear to have been present, but Buchanan, whose bitter invective must be accepted with caution, talks of her unprincely licentiousness and lack of modesty in all her words and doings. Probably, July 4, 2013-67, the poor lady was thirsting for a little of the gay abandonment and self-indulgence she loved so much, after her 6 weeks' illness in the gloomy castle on the cliff, and thought that the sea trip and change of scene would be beneficial. In any case, she did not enjoy her pleasure long undisturbed, for her husband took horse as soon as he heard of her departure, and rode to Alloa by Stirling to join her. But he met with a repellent reception, and left her a few hours later. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 28 July 1566. Whatever Buchanan may mean by Mary's licentious behaviour at Alloa, it is certain that the Queen did not neglect matters of state during the few days she stayed, as several official documents still extant prove. It was there, on the advice of her council, that she decided to proceed later in person to Jedburgh, for the purpose of holding an assize and punishing the riotous borderers, Johnstones, Elliots, Armstrongs, Kerrs, and the rest of them, who by their forays and feuds had reduced the neighbourhood to anarchy. It will be seen, therefore, that her journey to Jedburgh was not undertaken suddenly in consequence of Bothwell's wound, as Buchanan and others try to make out. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. August 1566. Bothwell was growing almost as unpopular as Darnley. The Earl had always been rough and masterful with the other nobles, and his sea-roving and border-reaving methods were considered hardly respectable. And there was still a rankling feud between him and Murray, though they were occasionally obliged to meet at court. He had been condemned more than once by his own queen for lawlessness, and had escaped serious punishment by his boldness or evasion. He did not belong to the Catholic party, and had refused to attend Mary's Mass, whilst he was at issue with the Friends of England. Standing thus alone, hated by his fellows, it would appear at first sight somewhat curious that Mary should have selected him especially for her instrument, unless she was captivated by him personally from the beginning. As she certainly was afterwards, Geo noted, no to the previous statement, but really he had one quality, apart from any personal attraction or ability, which made him the one man in all Scotland the fittest for Mary's purpose. The other nobles had, almost to a man, at one time or another succumbed to the bribes or blandishments of England. From the first, and July 4, 2013-68. Unwaveringly, Bothwell had been England's bitter enemy, and might be trusted to remain so. This in Mary's eyes must have outweighed much that was to be urged against him, and may well account for her first close association with him. With the greater hopes for the success of Mary's plans, inspired by the remittances and promises from Rome, Flanders and Spain, and by Elizabeth's evident helplessness, Bothwell's favour steadily grew, to the dismay of Murray and his friends. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 12th of August 1566. There was even a plot to assassinate him when he went to Edinburgh in August. Bothwell, writes Bedford on this day, has grown of late so much hated that he cannot long continue. He beareth all the sway, and though Murray be there, and has good words, yet can he do nothing. He and Murray came almost to blows in the Queen's presence at this time, because Murray wished to bring Lethington back into the Queen's favour. But Mary knew the men she wanted, and cleverly managed soon afterwards to reconcile Bothwell to the astute secretary's reappointment. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 13 to 19 August 1566. For some days Mary with her husband Murray Bothwell and Mar were hunting somewhat unsuccessfully in South Peebles, Darnley repaying by his loutish behaviour the neglect and indifference with which his wife treated him. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. Mid-August 1566. Sport in Ettrick Forest was bad, and after a week the sovereigns were back in Edinburgh. The Queen took the opportunity to make her husband a present of a newly reconstructed bed of violet-brown velvet, enriched with cloth of gold and silver, with ciphers and flowers sewn with gold and silk, furnished with roof and headpiece. It had curtains of violet damask, pillows of violet velvet, a blue taffeta quilt and Holland linen sheets. A costly and intimate gift. Ref. Lord Bothwell and Mary Queen of Scots. Footnote. Nelse Mary Stuart, p30 and Buchanan. On Mary's return from this expedition, the new French ambassador in London, La Foy, wrote to Catherine saying that Mary was at Stirling and her husband 8 leagues away hunting with a very small company, and discontented. Which, however, is no new thing or of any importance, for they cannot be together for 3 days without a riot. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. August 1566. On her way back to Edinburgh, Mary arranged that her child should be placed in safety at Stirling with Lady Murray, and thither she went herself on the 28th August to install him, and to receive Lethington with his friend Athol. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. Lethington was the best brain in the country, and for many months Mary had missed his subtle counsel. Discredited by his sympathy with the leaders of the chase about Raid, he had been dismissed for his subterranean labours in the Rizzio plot. Mary needed her late secretary's help in her plans for the baby's future. Only Maitland could improve relations with England and procure the promise of its throne for the infant. Bothwell might be a faithful servant and a good general. His very name would hinder a rapprochement with Elizabeth. So Hepburn interests were disregarded, and, in what seemed a longer-sighted policy, Lethington was restored to his post. Ref. Lord Bothwell and Mary Queen of Scots. What arguments Mary used to reconcile Bothwell to this may well be guessed. She had only to tell him that the secretary had been her first powerful instrument to conclude her Spanish alliance against Elizabeth. In any case, the Queen diplomatically managed a fortnight afterwards to bring them together, with Murray and herself, secretly in a private house in Edinburgh. And at her request, Bothwell graciously made friends with the restored secretary, and came also to some sort of working agreement with Murray and the Lords. Ref. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. August 1566. Mary had made Bothwell one of the 2 captains of the baby prince's bodyguard. Ref. Lord Bothwell and Mary Queen of Scots. September 1566. Darnley's unquiet spirit could not be happy without intrigue, and at the end of the first week in September, his wife returned alone to Edinburgh, to sit at her exchequer to understand her revenues. This sudden financial interest sprang from her plans for the christening of the prince. Every penny the treasury could spare was to dignify the occasion. What dreams did not the girl cherish for the baby who was to reconcile 2 warring kingdoms and even, she may have fondly hoped, 2 rival religions? When she had understood her revenues, she called a Privy Council meeting at Holyrood House and secured a vote of LL 12,000 for christening expenses. Next she sorted her jewels and had a happy thought for a colour scheme on the great day. Each nobleman should dress his retinue in one colour. To give a start she issued Moray a suit of green, Argyle a red and Bothwell a blue. It is perhaps significant that in blazonry the last colour stands for loyalty. She did not forget linings, red and gold for Moray, silver and white for Bothwell. Ref. Lord Bothwell and Mary Queen of Scots. September 1566. This private house, of which Lethington himself speaks, was doubtless that adjoining the dwelling of John Balfour, mentioned by Buchanan in this scandalous story of Mary's amours with Bothwell at this time. Previously nothing had been said implying that Mary was in love with the Border Earl, but Buchanan tells the story coarsely enough. His account is to the effect that the Queen moved from the private house into the exchequer, the garden of which had a door into the house of Bothwell's servant Chalmers. By the mediation of Lady Rears, or Mrs. Forbes of Rears, an infamous woman, now obese and elderly, but formerly Bothwell's mistress, who had been made one of the Queen's bedchamber ladies. Bothwell was brought from Chalmers' house to the Queen's lodging, and there, according to Mary's later statement, forced her against her will. With hollow mirth Buchanan, Geo noted, Mary's enemy, scoffs at this latter statement, and says that a few nights afterwards Mary sent Lady Rears to fetch Bothwell again to her chamber. The communicating door in the garden was this time closed, and as the corpulent Rizzio was being lowered over the wall by Mary and one of her maids, the rope broke, and the massive procuress came down a crash. Nothing dismayed, however, she waddled to the room in which Bothwell was sleeping with his, July 4, 2013, 71, young wife, and brought him, half-dressed, to the Queen's chamber. Buchanan, to substantiate this story, which he tells with a frankness impossible to be repeated here, says that George Dalgleish, Bothwell's chamberlain, declared it in his confession, made just before his execution for Darnley's murder, but it is certainly not in his confession as printed by Buchanan himself in the detection. Footnote: there is in the Hatfield Papers vol. Secu. p. 46, a curious account of Bothwell's servant, Chalmers. It is stated this man's career which to some extent confirms Buchanan's statement as to Mary's behaviour at this time. David Chalmers had been educated in France, and was made by Bothwell Provost of Creathtown, and afterwards Lord of Session, not for his learning, but because he had served Bothwell as a bawd and otherwise in his naughty practices. He was a great dealer betwixt the Queen and Bothwell, so, as Mr. David's lodging was chosen as a place meet to exercise their filthiness into, before the King's murder, when as the Queen lay at the Chequer House in the Cowgate, Lennox accused Chalmers of being an accomplice in Darnley's murder. Geo noted this information very important, ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. August, September 1566, the tenants of Pencateland complained that Sir William Sinclair of Herdmiston and James Ormiston of that ilk prevented them from harvesting their crops, claiming dues thereon. Ormiston produced a precept from Cuthbert Cranstown of Thirlestane Mains, and Sir James Castelord to the complainants directing them to account to him for their teensieves, and Sinclair alleged he had a promise of attack of the lands. On 21 September 1566, an interim order was passed directing Islay Herald to cut the corn and keep it in custody pending a final decision. 168. Geo noted, James Ormiston now involved in a handfest with Sir William's mother Margaret Sinclair. 12 September 1566. When Mary was returned to Edinburgh, George Buchanan wrote, she took not her lodging in her own palace, but in a private house next adjoining to John Balfour's. Thence she removed into another house, where the yearly court called the Exchequer was then kept. There dwelt hard by one David Chalmers, Bothwell's servant, whose back door adjoined to the garden of the July 4, 2013, 72. Queen's lodging. The rest, who guesses not, for the Queen herself confessed the matter both to many other, and also namely to the Regent and his mother. But she laid all the blame upon my Lady Rizzio, a woman of most vile unchastity, who had sometime been one of Bothwell's harlots, and then was one of the chief of the Queen's privy chamber. By this woman, who now in her age had from the gain of whoredom betaken herself to the craft of bawdry, was the Queen, as herself said, betrayed, for Bothwell was through the garden brought into the Queen's chamber, and there forced her against her will forsooth. Buffoonery follows about a rope that broke a few days later in lowering Margaret Rizzio, a woman very heavy, both by unwieldy age and massy substance, over the garden wall to fetch Bothwell out of his bed, even out of his wife's arms, half asleep, half naked, to repay force with force. Upon obscene rubbish of this sort, the story of the loves of Mary and Bothwell, which 9 Englishmen or Frenchmen out of 10 believe, has been erected. The inherent impossibilities of Buchanan's bawdy conjectures and filthy suspicions are hardly worth listing. If Lennox starts the legendary adultery before the birth of the prince, how can Buchanan describe an initial rape 3 months later? Sir John Forster, an accurate reporter, gives the 8th of September as the date of Mary's homecoming, to sit at her exchequer, and further records that she was at Holyrood House by 12th of September. These 2 dates destroy the remains of Buchanan's fabrication. How could Mary, between the 8th and the 12th, take up residence next door to Balfour, move house to the exchequer, be surprised there by Bothwell, who seems to have been quite indifferent to the inevitable presence of courtiers, ladies, servants or guards, and within few days after, recall her seducer to the same spot by the agency of Lady Rizzio? Margaret Rizzio was the baby's wet nurse and was far more likely to be attending her charge at Stirling than her mistress at the exchequer. The nature of her duties proves that she cannot have been as elderly as Buchanan says, and suggests that he has confused her with her elder sister, Janet Betton, who 7 years earlier, at the age of 43, was Bothwell's mistress. Not even the Lumen Boreal refulgens can expect his readers to accept a statement that a queen confessed these improprieties, not merely to her austere half-brother and his less austere mother, but to many other, He sets the final stamp of mendacity on his story when he asserts that George Dalgleish attested it before his death, and that his confession is extant. It contains no sentence incriminating the Queen. Perhaps a rival pamphleteer did not far exaggerate when he calls the great Latinist, this bawdy fellow, the filthiest of men and dunghill puddle and sink of filth. Ref. Lord Bothwell and Mary Queen of Scots. 11. End of September 1566. The fact that Mary did lodge in the Exchequer House during this period is testified to by Sir J. Forster, who says that she was busy there at the time about her revenues, although she must have gone sometimes to Holyrood, as we hear of her there sorting and arranging her finery for the coming christening, and ordering the new clothes for her courtiers. Her husband, we are told, she held in light estimation now, and she had never even seen Lennox since Rizzio's death. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 24 September 1566, Darnley seems to have come unexpectedly from Stirling, where he had been staying, to Edinburgh. Mary, when she heard of his coming, purposely fled out of the Chequer House and passed to the palace of Holyrood House. Why she should have fled from the Exchequer, if there was nothing wrong, is not clear, and although the positive assertion of Mary's amour with Bothwell having commenced then and there depends entirely on Buchanan's and Lennox's statements, it may have as well been then as later. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 29 September 1566. Darnley had found his position becoming more and more intolerable. He was deservedly scorned by his wife for his bodily viciousness and his mental instability. Even Bothwell could do without him now, and Darnley declared to his father at Stirling on this day his intention to fly to France in a ship which was then awaiting him. Lennox was shocked, and at once wrote to Mary warning her, but he would have been even more shocked and angry if he had known, as we do, the depth of his son's folly. Seeing that Bothwell and Lethington had been reconciled, and that Murray, Athol, Huntley, and even Argyle were rapidly, in appearance at least, coming round to Mary's plans, the foolish young man now endeavoured to raise an extreme. July 4, 2013-74, Catholic counter-conspiracy by appealing to the Pope and denouncing Mary's religious lukewarmness in consorting with heretics like Murray. And he had the turpitude to claim for himself the purely Catholic aid that was to be sent to Scotland. Footnote: the Queen, Mary, had told Murray about the aid she was receiving from the Pope, and although it is difficult to believe that he would in any case have acquiesced in the establishment of Popish predominance in Scotland, he must have been aware of the active negotiations being carried on with the Catholics at this period, the coming and going of papal envoys, the constant messages to Spain and Spanish Flanders, and the close intimacy of all the Scottish envoys to London, even the Melvilles, with the Spanish ambassador there. Even the Scottish Protestants, disgusted at Elizabeth's attitude, appear for a time to have been willing to second Mary's plans, depending doubtless upon her solemn pledge to make no religious changes in her realm. The idea was not without cunning, combined as it was with the intention to look to France instead of to Spain, and to make use of their national jealousy, in order to place him in the position of a rival to his wife's claims, to the crown of Scotland in right of his son, and to that of England in right of his mother. But his letters to the Pope had been intercepted, his tentative advances to France were laughed at, and the poor creature, distracted and feeble of purpose, instead of embarking on his waiting ship, suddenly appeared at Holyrood at 10 o'clock at night of the day that his wife had received the letter saying that he was going to France. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. King Henry, Darnley, threatening to go abroad. Grant, O Lord, waiter of me, proceed. Be to thy glory, honour and praise indeed. Mary's prayer at the birth of her son. Mary Queen of Scots, a narrative and defence by Reverend Alexander Walker. He was in a penitential mood, but, in answer to Mary's reproaches and inquiries as to what he complained of, he would say nothing. Late as it was, she summoned a meeting of her council and nobles, with the French ambassador, to hear what her husband had to. July 4, 2013-75, say for himself. She again, before them all, demanded the reason of his proposed flight, and besought him, solemnly and with clasped hands, to say whether he had any fault to find with her. The lords likewise said that they saw he looked at them askance. Had they done anything to offend him or give reason for his flight? Then the French ambassador, a stout Guisan, took him in hand, and lectured him roundly. If he was moved, said de Croc, by anything the Queen had done, it was his duty to her and to himself to say what it was. If otherwise, his object in flying abroad could not fail to be reprehensible. Darnley remained pouting and silent for a long time, but at length declared that he had no reason to allege for his proposed flight. Mary said she was satisfied with this, and the rest of those present promised to bear witness to Darnley's declaration in her favour. But the young man could do nothing graciously, and he skulked out of the room without kissing his wife, muttering as he went that it would be a long time ere she saw him again, and before the night was past news was brought to her that he still meant to sail away if he could. But he lacked resolution either to go or to stay, and a few days afterwards, whilst the Queen was on the border, he wrote begging de Croc to meet him and his father a few miles from Edinburgh. It is evident that Darnley was a lost man from this time. He had not a single friend, not even himself. Morton, and the other accomplices he had betrayed, were certain to kill him sooner or later, if no one else did so. Murray would not lift a finger to save a man who had never ceased to plot his destruction. Bothwell had no longer any need of his help, but on the contrary was now, of all men in the world, the most interested in his prompt removal from the living. Mary, too, could not desire the prolongation of the life of a husband who had disgusted and affronted her personally, had perversely thwarted her politically, had betrayed her interests, joined her enemies against her, and now seemed to stand fair in the path of her happiness as a woman, and her success as a queen. Mary yearned for the full enjoyment of life. She had always been pampered and flattered, and she resented any obstacle to the attainment of her ends. Her great dream of a Catholic Britain under her sceptre was never long absent from her mind, though the steadfastness and sacrifice needed for its realization were sometimes hard for her pleasure-loving nature to endure. But when unnecessary and wanton difficulties were interposed by the very man whom she had chosen for her husband in order the better to carry through her policy, when, in addition to this, the yoke-mate she had thought she loved, repelled and disgusted her, then she would have not been self-indulgent Mary Stuart, bred in the Guisan school and at the court of France, if she had not, like another Pilate, washed her hands of him and left him to the scant mercy of his enemies, from whom, in any case, she would have been powerless to save him without sacrificing herself. And Mary Stuart never willingly sacrificed herself for anyone, least of all for one who was in her way. Geo noted, only Ormiston, ref, the love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. The lieutenant of the marches cannot keep the assize hope. There was none in store for me till Darnley filled his grave. Town, Mary Queen of Scots, a narrative and defence by Reverend Alexander Walker. 7th October 1566. Bothwell, in execution of his office, had gone to the Liddesdale district to bring the border thieves into something like order. He sallied from his stronghold, the Hermitage, for the purpose of apprehending a notorious robber, one John Elliot of the Park, whom he shot with a pistol. The freebooter, wounded but not disabled, turned upon the Earl, and it was believed at the time, killed him. The supposed corpse was placed in a cart and carried to Hermitage, the news being sent to meet the Queen, who was on the way to Jedburgh. She learned of his supposed death either on the way to, or on her arrival at, Jedburgh on the same day, and instead of rushing off, as alleged, to Hermitage to see Bothwell, who she soon learned was not dead, but only badly wounded in the thigh, she attended to the business of the assize, until she adjourned it on the 15th of October. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 14th of October 1566. Mary rode out with Murray and her other nobles privately to witness a conference between the English warden of the Eastern Marches and her officers. The love affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 15th of October 1566. A week after his misfortune, Mary saw Bothwell for the first time, he having been carried from Hermitage to Jedburgh in a horse litter, a journey of 25 or 30 miles. Bothwell seems to have remained at Jedburgh that night, and on the following morning Mary, escorted by Murray and others, rode to Hermitage with Bothwell, returning to Jedburgh the same evening. Footnote: Mr. Andrew Lang appears to question Bothwell's visit to Jedburgh on the 15th. I know not on what ground, as Sir J. Forster, writing from Berwick on the 15th of October, distinctly states that Bothwell came this day to Jedburgh in a litter, and writing again on the 23rd. The same officer mentions Bothwell's second visit thus: the Earl of Bothwell came to Jedburgh on the 21st in a horse litter. Bothwell does not appear to have returned to Hermitage after this, and he probably went to visit the Queen when he learned of her serious illness, which appears to have reached a crisis on the 20th or 21st October. 17 October 1566, the Queen suddenly became ill. October 1566, de Croc says that whilst Mary and the Lords were now quite united, they could do nothing with Darnley, who wished to command everything and everybody. No one took any notice of him, says de Croc, and he complained constantly to the latter. At last the Frenchman told him that if he would say what he had to complain of, he would speak to Mary and her council in his favour. "I want to fill the same position that I did when I was first married," he replied. "That is quite impossible," said the Croc. "You ought to have kept the place when you had it. You have offended the Queen, and you cannot expect she will give you power again. You ought to think yourself very fortunate that she honours you as she does, treating you as her husband, and providing you and your house with everything." Labanoff, Vol. IP 375. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 21 October until 15 November 1566, Bothwell again came to Jedburgh in a horse litter, and the intention was for Mary to travel thence to Hume Castle, and so along the frontier to Eyemouth. But the plan was upset by the sudden and dangerous illness of the Queen, who the day after Bothwell's arrival was believed to be in articulo mortis, as she, July 4, 2013-78, was again on the 25 October. Footnote: on the occasion of her second attack of what may have been some form of hysteria, she was thought actually to have died. Nayu, in his account, says that Murray began to seize the plate, jewellery and other valuables. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. 15 November 1566. Illness kept Mary at Jedburgh until this day. Darnley remaining, except for one day's tardy visit to his wife, sulky and neglected at Linlithgow, Glasgow, and Stirling the while. And Mary, surrounded by Murray, Bothwell, Huntly, Hume, Lethington, and 500 horsemen, then rode on her way to Dunbar and Edinburgh to prepare for the stately christening of her child. On her way she passed Coldingham through a strip of English territory, where she was courteously greeted by the English general, and on Halidon Hill heard the salute of all the ordnance on the walls of Berwick fired in her honour. "There have been many cumbers between these two realms," she said, as she turned to Sir John Forster, the English warden, "but I will never give occasion for war between England and Scotland." She charged the border nobles Hume, Bothwell, and Kerr of Cessford to keep order in their bounds, and then, knowing that it would give pleasure to the Englishmen, she made a remark. A mere passing politeness it seemed, but it was the death warrant of her husband. She was, she said, a favour of the Earl of Morton and his company. Ref. The Love Affairs of Mary Queen of Scots. Geo noted, Ormiston wrote to Forster, letter in archives. November 1566. At Craigmillar, Mary and Darnley spent a miserable week in November when her husband's treacherous participation in Rizzio's murder, and his jealous distrust of Moray's influence, had caused a deep estrangement between them. Ducroc, the French ambassador, in a letter to Archbishop Beaton, Mary's envoy in Paris, describes the Queen's despondent frame of mind. Before the departure of the unhappy couple from Craigmillar, the plot for Darnley's murder had been elaborated between Moray, Lethington, Argyll, Huntly, and Bothwell. And the deed of agreement was here drawn up for the conspirators by Sir James Balfour, the parson of Fliscay. Craigmillar was the spot first suggested by Mary for Darnley's quarantine during his convalescence after smallpox, and it was his own captious objection to being lodged there that led to July 4, 2013-79, the choice of the fatal Kirkhoe field, as Darnley's servant testified before the English council. It was first devised in Glasgow that the king should have lain at Craigmillar, but because he had no will thereof, the purpose was altered, and conclusion taken that he should lie beside the Kirkhoe field. December 1566. Later, in Buchanan's history, it is casually mentioned that Mary wished to involve Moray and Morton in the guilt of Darnley's murder. But how had Morton returned to Scotland? Of that, not a word. In truth, both French and English influence had been used. Bothwell, acting like a very friend, says Bedford, and others had openly added their intercessions. James's baptism was an occasion for an amnesty, and this was granted on Christmas Eve. The pardon might well have been given, even had no divorce or murder of Darnley been intended. But the step was most threatening to Darnley's safety, as the exiles hated him with a deadly hatred. On the whole, taking the unsigned protestation document of Huntly and Argyll to be part of Mary's counter-accusations against her accusers, with the document which they did sign, it seems probable or certain that a conference as to getting rid of Darnley in some way was held at Craigmillar, where Moray certainly was. Moray in London was shown the intercepted protestation, and denied that anything was said at Craigmillar in his hearing tending to only unlawful or dishonourable end. But, if the protestation can be trusted, nothing positively unlawful was proposed. Lethington promised nothing but good, and approved by Parliament. Moray also denied having signed a band, except that of October 1567, but about a band the protestation says nothing. Moray may have referred to what Hay of Tallis said at his execution, 3 January 1567. He had seen a band signed by Bothwell, Huntly, Argyle, Lethington, and Sir James Balfour. The first four, at least, were at Craigmillar. Much later, on the 13th of December 1573, Ormiston confessed that, about Easter, after the murder, Bothwell tried to reassure him by showing him a contract subscribe it be 4 or 5 handwrits. Quilke affirm it to me was the subscription of the Earl of Huntly, Argyle, the Secretary Maitland, and Sir James Balfour. The contract or band stated that Darnley must be got rid of, by Ainway or Arthur, and that all who signed should defend any who did the deed. It was subscribed a quarter of a year before the murder, that is, taking the phrase widely, after the Craigmillar conference. Next comes from Lennox, Darnley's father, attempts at producing a discourse. This can be dated. It ends with the remark that, after Langside fight, Mary spoke with Ormiston and Hob Ormiston, who were of the chiefest murderers of the king, her husband. Not true, of course. These men now live with the Laird of Withor in Liddesdale, who keepeth in his house a prisoner, one Andrew Curry, of Fordenside, by her commandment. This was Andrew Kerr of Foldenside, the most brutal of the murderers of Rizzio. Ref. The Mystery of Mary Stuart by Andrew Lang. From the book, The Mystery of Mary Stuart by Andrew Lang. Mary was sorely bested then between the young fool, the furious man, the Puritan brother, and Michael Wiley, Machiavelli, as the Scots nicknamed Lethington. She was absolutely alone. There was no man whom she could trust. On every hand were known rebels, half pardoned, half reconciled. Feuds, above all that of her husband and his clan, the Lennox Stuarts, with the nearest heirs of the crown, the Hamiltons, broke out eternally. The Protestants hated her. The preachers longed to drag her down. The English ambassadors were hostile spies. France was far away. The Queen Mother was her enemy, her kindred. The Guises were cold or powerless. She saw only one strong man who had been loyal, one protector who had served her mother and saved herself. That man was Bothwell. Ref. The Mystery of Mary Stuart by Andrew Lang. Mary little dreams of the calamity about to fall upon her. I was a witness on that night of all his shame and guilt. I saw his outrage on the Queen. I saw the blood he spilt, and ere the day had dawned I swore, while spurring through the sand, I would avenge that treachery. July 4, 2013, 81. And slay him with my hand, or, in the preacher's cherished phrase, would purge him from the land. Bothwell. Ref. Mary Queen of Scots. A Narrative and Defence by Reverend Alexander Walker. December 1566. The king was attacked with smallpox at Glasgow. The Queen came to his bedside, and a reconciliation seemed to have taken place between them. January 1567 note. Mary wrote Glasgow letter to James Ormiston, 27, 31 January 1567. The Queen carried Darnley from Glasgow to Edinburgh. She took up her residence at Holyrood. But as infection was still feared for the infant prince, Darnley took up his lodging in the Provost's house, just outside the walls of Edinburgh, which was known as the Kirk o' Field, a religious house on the site now occupied by the College of Edinburgh.